What if I told you that the US China trade war has quietly evolved into something far more dangerous? A global campaign where Washington is forcing its friends to choose sides, even if it costs them billions. How does the US government convince a sovereign nation like the Netherlands to seize a multi-billion-dollar company seemingly against its own economic interests? In the intricate and high stakes arena of modern geopolitics, the lines between economic competition, national security, and outright warfare have blurred into a near indistinguishable haze. The escalating rivalry between the United States and China, long defined by tariffs and trade deficits, has metastasized into a far more complex and consequential struggle. This is no longer a simple bilateral dispute about repatriating jobs or balancing ledgers. It is a systemic battle for control over the entire global economic order. At the heart of this new strategy is a clear and aggressive American playbook. The weaponization of its vast economic toolkit, from sanctions to export controls, not only to hamstring Beijing, but also to coerce and strong arm its own allies into a unified anti China front. The expropriation of the Dutch semiconductor firm Nexperia serves as the critical case study for this new doctrine. It is a story that unfolds far beyond the boardrooms of a single company, revealing a perfect storm of direct American pressure, internal corporate espionage, and the calculated exploitation of a weak allied government. The Nexperia saga is more than just a business headline. It is a microcosm of this new era, demonstrating in stark detail how Washington is forcing a choose sides ultimatum upon the world, turning trusted partners into pawns and the global supply chain into a battlefield. To really understand what's happening, we first have to look at this new American economic strategy, which is all about weaponizing alliances and tools like the entity list. The 21st century economic conflict being waged by Washington bears little resemblance to the trade wars of the past. The central shift is one of scope and intent. While previous administrations focused on leveling the playing field, the current strategy is to fundamentally redesign the field itself and dictate who is allowed to play on it. This evolution is most evident in the shift beyond simple tariffs. While tariffs on goods like timber, kitchen cabinets, and furniture remain a component of the pressure campaign, the conflict center of gravity has moved. It is no longer exclusively about bringing jobs back home or protecting domestic manufacturing. Instead, it has escalated into a comprehensive multi domain battle for technological and economic supremacy, with the explicit goal of reasserting American control over the global order and arresting China's rise. To achieve this, Washington has unsheathed its most powerful economic weapons. The primary tools are no longer just tariffs, but a sophisticated trifecta of export controls, sanctions, and, most powerfully, the entity list. This list, maintained by the Department of Commerce, is a blacklist that effectively bars American companies from doing business with named foreign entities without government approval. What began as a targeted tool has been expanded dramatically. The number of Chinese entities on the export control list has ballooned from roughly 3,000 to several thousand more, particularly after the rules were changed to include any subsidiary that is over 50% owned by an already blacklisted company. This expansion reveals the tool's dual purpose. It is not only a direct fire weapon aimed at Beijing, targeting its technological champions like Huawei or SMIC, it is also a tool of immense leverage to force American allies from the European Union to democracies across Asia like India and South Korea to fall into line. The implicit threat is clear. Align with our economic strategy, or your own critical industries may find themselves on the receiving end of these same debilitating sanctions. This aggressive posturing is amplified by the administration's apocalyptic rhetoric. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, a key architect of this hardline approach, has framed the conflict in existential terms. He accuses China of pointing a bazooka at the supply chains and the industrial base of the entire free world, declaring that we're not going to have it. This language deliberately casts the struggle as China versus the world, a Manichaean battle between a rogue bad actor and the free world. This framing is politically essential as it provides the moral and political justification for the coercive tactics Washington is now deploying against its own partners, painting any allied resistance as naive, worse, as complicity with the aggressor. This hardline strategy, however, exists in a delicate and often contradictory dance with domestic political reality. This tension is personified by President Donald Trump himself, who oscillates wildly between playing the roles of good cop and bad cop, often in the same week. His political survival is inextricably linked to the performance of the American stock market, which he views as a personal barometer of his success. This creates a strange and volatile pattern. On one hand, Trump wants to maintain relentless pressure on China. He will publicly state that his relationship with President Xi gets testy because China likes to take advantage of people. On the other hand, a stock market crash, which his own threats often provoke, could be fatal to his approval ratings, which are already at record lows. This dynamic has given rise to a strategy known to traders as TACO, an acronym for Trump always chickens out. The taco pattern is predictable. Trump will issue a shocking threat, such as threatening 100% tariffs on Chinese goods, which immediately sends markets into a tailspin. One such threat famously wiped over $2 trillion off of global markets in a single day. Then, as the political fallout mounts, he chickens out. By Sunday evening, he will post a conciliatory message on social media telling supporters, don't worry about China. It will all be fine, and claiming highly respected President Xi just had a bad moment. This walk back is designed to calm markets and reassure his base. Traders have learned to exploit this, buying the dip after every Trump induced shock, confident that a reversal is imminent. This good cop routine from the president allows the bad cops within his administration to pursue their hawkish agenda unimpeded. While Trump manages the public facing political fallout, figures like Scott Bessent are free to lead the charge on the ground. This team is actively floating a chilling array of new options to escalate the economic war. These include the potential expulsion of the over 400,000 Chinese students currently studying at American universities, a move that would sever a deep academic and cultural tie. They are also considering sanctioning the stocks of major Chinese companies listed on US exchanges, such as Alibaba, which would be a direct assault on China's access to Western capital. Furthermore, they are exploring ways to target Chinese firms involved in purchasing Russian oil. This is a particularly shrewd maneuver, as it would allow the administration to sanction Chinese entities under the political cover of the Russia Ukraine conflict, thereby avoiding a direct link to the trade talks and minimizing the immediate shock to US stock markets. This multi pronged asymmetric approach demonstrates the breadth and creativity of America's newly weaponized economic toolkit, where every facet of global integration, from education to finance to energy, is now a potential front in the war against Beijing. Now, to see how this aggressive new strategy is being implemented in the real world, we don't need to look any further than the dramatic and unprecedented expropriation of Nexperia, a European semiconductor firm. This case moves the conflict from the realm of abstract threats to a concrete, tangible corporate takedown, providing a chilling blueprint for how the United States is leveraging its allies to prosecute its economic war. Nexperia's corporate profile made it the perfect target for this new doctrine. It is a company with a strategically fractured identity. On paper, it is a European firm based in the Netherlands, a key American ally. In reality, it has been owned by China's Wingtech since approximately 2018. This dual identity, a European head on a Chinese body, placed it directly in the crosshairs of Washington's expanding economic dragnet. Under Wingtech's ownership, Nexperia was a resounding success story, a fact that inconveniently contradicts the Western narrative that Chinese ownership is inherently parasitic or destructive. Wingtech took what was a loss making European entity and, through investment and integration, transformed it into a multi billion-dollar, highly profitable global competitor. Nexperia became a powerhouse, shipping approximately 100 billion semiconductor units annually. It employs around 14,000 people globally, with a significant footprint of 10,000 employees in Europe itself, making it a major contributor to the continent's economy. But its operational reality told a different story. Nexperia's success was and is inextricably linked to China. A staggering 80% of its total production occurs in China. 70% of its chips, even those fabricated in Europe, must be sent to China for final processing and packaging. And nearly half of its total sales, 48%, are to Chinese companies. This deep integration made Nexperia an indispensable part of China's tech ecosystem. Crucially, Nexperia is not a niche player. It is a critical supplier for the entire global automotive industry. Its chips are essential components in the complex electronic systems of modern vehicles. This status as a key node in a vital supply chain made its control a matter of strategic importance, not just for Europe and China, but for the United States as well. The seizure itself was a shocking and sudden maneuver executed by the DM. In a action that stunned the business world, the Netherlands invoked a wartime piece of legislation, the Goods Availability Act, a relic of the Cold War, passed in 1952. This obscure law was ostensibly designed to allow the government to secure critical supplies during a national emergency. Brandishing this act, the Dutch government effectively nationalized the company overnight. The Chinese CEO, Jiang Shijie, was immediately ousted. The entire Chinese led board of directors was suspended. A non Chinese director, vested with full voting rights, was appointed by the state. And in the final move, all company shares, including Wingtech's controlling stake, were frozen and placed under the management of a trustee. It was a complete and total expropriation executed with stunning speed against the property of a foreign nation. The official justification provided by the Dutch government was one of national security. In public statements, they warned that losing the chip capabilities owned by Nexperia could pose a risk to Dutch and European economic security. The stated goal was to prevent sensitive technology from leaking to China. But as the dust settled, it became overwhelmingly clear that this official narrative was a thin veil, concealing a far more complex and coercive story. The decision was not made in a vacuum in The Hague. It was the culmination of intense, behind the scenes pressure from Washington and a bitter internal corporate power struggle. But that official story of a sovereign government just acting on its own to protect national security, that quickly unraveled. It revealed a perfect storm of three distinct forces that really brought about Nexperia's seizure, direct and unrelenting American pressure, a pattern of previous U.S. coercion, and a vicious internal corporate coup that provided the immediate pretext. The smoking gun of American involvement was the revelation of a direct ultimatum delivered to the Dutch government. In June, months before the seizure, the U.S. administration had explicitly pressured its Dutch counterparts, demanding they oust Nexperia's Chinese CEO. This was not a polite request, it was a threat. Dutch officials were explicitly warned that if they did not seize control of Nexperia, the United States would unilaterally add the company to its entity list. This was a death sentence, as the U.S. had already destroyed the Chinese market for ASML. The Dutch knew this was no idle threat. An entity list designation would have effectively killed Nexperia by cutting it off from all U.S. technology and financial markets through the power of extraterritorial sanctions. The legal justification for this threat was already in place. The U.S. had previously sanctioned Nexperia's parent company, Wingtech, when the 50% ownership rule was expanded, a rule change that ballooned the entity list by several thousand firms. Nexperia was automatically caught in the net. The U.S. was simply telling the Netherlands that it was time to enforce the new rules. This was the weaponization of the entity list in its most potent form, not as a direct sanction, but as a coercive tool to force an ally's hand. This diplomatic theater placed the Netherlands in an impossible position. Publicly, the Dutch government continues to insist that it made the decision on its own with no exterior pressure. But Beijing immediately and publicly accused them of kowtowing to U.S. interests. This episode starkly illustrates the new reality for U.S. allies. They are being forced to choose between their own economic interests and the demands of their security guarantor. This was not the first time the Netherlands had been forced to make such a choice. The Nexperia case followed the exact playbook the US had used against ASML, the Netherlands' most valuable company. ASML is the crown jewel of the Dutch economy, a technological marvel that often represents over 20% of the entire AEX stock index and whose exports drive the Dutch trade surplus. For years, the US pressured the Dutch government to block ASML from selling its most advanced lithography machines to China. The Dutch, desperate to protect their top company, resisted. Eventually, they succumbed to Washington's demands, effectively destroying the critical Chinese market for ASML and inflicting significant damage on their own economy. This pattern was not limited to the Netherlands. In 2022, Nexperia's UK manufacturing arm faced a similar fate. The British government, also citing vague national security concerns, forced Nexperia to divest to sell off its UK based factory. In a telling epilogue, that factory was subsequently purchased by an American company. This precedent added a layer of profound suspicion to the Nexperia seizure. Was this truly about protecting European security, or was it about using state power to eliminate a Chinese owned competitor and open the door for American firms? This intense external pressure from the US created a fertile ground for the third and final factor, a bitter internal coup within Nexperia itself. The immediate trigger for the Dutch government seizure was not an intelligence brief from Washington, but an urgent petition filed on October 1st by three high level Nexperia executives: Koo Ruben Leichenberg, CFO Stefan Telgar, and COO Akeem Kemp. Their petition, which prompted the court ordered changes, was not based on national security. The accusation was one of corporate malfeasance. They claimed that the CEO Zhang Shijue had abused his power by forcing Nexperia to place an excessive $200 million order with another company he owned, Win Sky Semi. The executives argued that a $100 million order would have been sufficient. This accusation, even if true, is a textbook corporate governance dispute, a matter for the board of directors, not the state. The executives could have and should have raised the issue with the board to seek the CEO's removal. Instead, they bypassed all normal corporate channels and directly to the Dutch courts and government. This extraordinary breach of protocol, described by observers as an illegal robbery, strongly suggests an ulterior motive. It is seen as a power struggle with the European executives, two of whom are German nationals, one Dutch, colluding with politicians to oust their Chinese boss. This internal dispute provided the pretext the Dutch government needed to act. It was the perfect storm, a racist tinged internal power struggle happening at the exact moment of intense U.S. geopolitical pressure, all while the Dutch government itself was in a weak and temporary state. The ruling coalition had collapsed in August, and a new election was not scheduled until October 29th. This vulnerable transitional government was uniquely susceptible to the combined pressure from Nexperia's executives and Washington, allowing it to take a drastic step it might otherwise have avoided. So, as you can imagine, this seizure, which was perhaps intended as a clean and surgical move, instead triggered an immediate and chaotic international incident. It set off a chain reaction of retaliatory measures and corporate anarchy that has already begun to disrupt the global supply chain. China's response was swift, precise, and devastating. In a tit for tat move, Beijing immediately banned all Nexperia chips from being exported from China. This countermeasure was a masterstroke. Given that 80% of Nexperia's production and 70% of its final processing are located in China, the Dutch government had effectively seized a hollowed out European shell company. China, by contrast, retained control over the vast majority of the firm's actual assets, production facilities, and inventory. Simultaneously, China's Ministry of Commerce made a defiant legal declaration. It would make Nexperia a pure Chinese company, asserting its own legal jurisdiction over the entity registered in China and its assets. This was a flat out rejection of the Dutch expropriation, signaling that China would simply ignore the new trustee management. When the Dutch Commerce Minister, panicking at the prospect of the supply chain collapsing, attempted to contact his Chinese counterpart to ask for an exemption from the ban, he was rebuffed. China's message was blunt. There would be no talks until the illegal seizure was reversed. This geopolitical standoff immediately plunged the company itself into a state of civil war. Nexperia is, for all practical purposes, being torn apart. Employees are caught in an impossible tug of war, receiving contradictory orders from two different command structures. The bosses of the Chinese unit in China sent a memo to all employees instructing them to ignore any and all instructions coming from the new Dutch headquarters. They further assured them that their salaries would continue to be paid by the Chinese entity. Hours later, the new Dutch appointed headquarters hit back with its own memo, insisting that it was in control, that its orders were the only valid ones, and that it would be the one to pay the salaries. In a further escalation, the new Dutch controlled entity reportedly fired all of its Chinese employees, severing the last remaining links between the two warring halves of the company. The ripple effects of this chaos are now spreading outward, threatening to fulfill the very prophecies of disruption that the seizure was meant to prevent. The global automotive industry, already heavily reliant on Nexperia's chips, is sounding the alarm. The Alliance for Automobile Innovation, a powerful lobbying group that represents virtually every major car manufacturer, including General Motors, Ford, Toyota, BMW, and Honda, issued an urgent statement. They warned that if the Nexperia saga is not resolved quickly, it will lead to significant disruption throughout the entire automobile manufacturing supply chain. This outcome is the ultimate bitter irony of the entire affair. The Dutch government invoked the Goods Availability Act of 1952, a law whose entire stated purpose is to protect crucial supply chains and ensure the availability of important goods during a crisis. By stepping in and seizing the company, the Dutch government did the exact opposite. It single handedly created the crisis, broke the supply chain, and caused the very disruption it was legally designed to prevent, all while acting as a proxy in America's escalating economic war. Asterisk, asterisk. What this chaos and subsequent disruption truly lays bare is that the United States has unequivocally entered an era of aggressive techno nationalism. The Nexperia and ASML cases are not random, isolated trade spats. They are calculated frontline battles in a global war for technological supremacy fought over the world's new most critical resource semiconductors. In the 20th century, global power was built on controlling the flow of oil. In the 21st, it is built on controlling the design and fabrication of microchips. These tiny, complex pieces of silicon are the brains powering every facet of modern life, from artificial intelligence and supercomputing to advanced military hardware, 5G networks, and the entire green energy transition. By targeting ASML, the US aims to sever China's access to the future of high end chip making, as ASML is the sole global producer of the extreme ultraviolet EUV lithography machines necessary for the most advanced nodes. By targeting Nexperia, the US is attacking the present, the foundational mature node chips that are the workhorses of the global economy, particularly in the automotive industry. This is the small yard, high fence strategy in action. The US is attempting to build an impenetrable fence around the small yard of critical choke point technologies to contain China's development. But the Nexperia case reveals the fundamental flaw in this strategy. The small yard is not small at all. It is a vast, deeply interconnected global ecosystem that has been built over decades. You cannot pull one thread like a Dutch company owned by a Chinese firm making chips for German cars without unraveling the entire tapestry. The collateral damage, as the Alliance for Automobile Innovation warned, is not inflicted just on the target, but on the allies themselves. This forces a devastating choice upon nations like the Netherlands, South Korea, and Japan. They are being asked to commit acts of economic self harm, deliberately damaging their own flagship companies and domestic economies, all to serve Washington's foreign policy objectives. This aggressive US posturing doesn't just create resentment, it fundamentally challenges the very concept of European or Asian economic sovereignty. It sends a chilling message that their industrial policy is ultimately subservient to American security demands. Furthermore, this strategy is accelerating the very outcome it claims to be preventing. By waging a full spectrum campaign to block, sanction, and seize its tech assets, the US is providing Beijing with all the justification it needs to pour hundreds of billions of dollars into its own domestic semiconductor industry. This creates a profound strategic paradox. The US strategy of containment relies on the leverage it gets from China's dependence on the global supply chain. But by weaponizing that dependence, the US is forcing China into a desperate state sponsored sprint for independence. In the long run, this may only succeed in creating a completely bifurcated global tech ecosystem, a splinter net, and splinter net of things with one American led sphere and one Chinese led sphere. In that new world, every other nation will be forced into an impossible choice, and the very interdependence that gave the US its economic leverage in the first place will be gone forever. The Nexperia saga may well be remembered as the moment this bifurcation became irreversible, a Pyrrhic victory for American strategy that cost it the unified global system it once led. Asterisk, asterisk. When you take a step back, the Nexperia case, in its totality, really serves as a powerful symbol. It's a warning flare illuminating this new treacherous landscape of global trade and the broader implications of America's push for a forced united front. It demonstrates that the US China conflict has entered a new phase, one defined less by direct confrontation and more by a US strategy of consolidating control over its allies and weaponizing the global economic system against Beijing. Nexperia is simply the first, most visible casualty of this new doctrine. The playbook used in the Netherlands is already being redeployed for the next major battle, rare earth minerals. The US administration, led by Scott Bessent, is actively working to build a united front of allies, including the European Union and India, to isolate China on the global stage for its control over these critical materials. China's dominance in rare earths, which are essential for everything from smartphones to advanced defense systems, is seen as a strategic vulnerability for the West. This initiative may prove more successful than the Nexperia power play, whereas the seizure of a single company was seen as a US driven overreach that primarily damaged the Dutch economy. China's export controls on rare earth minerals are a critical issue that genuinely threatens the economies of all industrial nations. The EU's trade chief and India's leadership have both expressed serious problems and complications arising from China's actions. In this instance, Washington's interests and its allies' interests may genuinely align, providing the global goodwill that was so starkly absent in the Nexperia case. Ultimately, the Nexperia saga exposes the profound and painful dilemma facing Europe and other US allies. They are trapped in an impossible position, caught between their deep economic integration with and dependence on China and their long standing security reliance on the United States. Nexperia, a company vital to Europe's own automotive and chip industries, became a sacrificial lamb. The lesson is stark. Washington is no longer merely requesting that its allies pick a side. It is actively engineering events, applying direct economic and political pressure, and forcing them to become extensions of its own anti China strategy. The fight is no longer just about tariffs or port fees. or even a single company. As the Nexperia case proves, the United States is pulling the entire world into its fight, whether they want to or not, risking a full blown fracture of the global economic order it claims to be protecting